May 8, 1945. The Pacific breeze carried a heavy stillness as dawn broke across the American-controlled island of Oahu. The sky was pale, washed-out gold, stretching over the mountains and the restless surf. On the northern side of the island, where sugarcane fields gave way to dusty military roads, a convoy of olive-drab trucks rolled steadily toward a makeshift POW processing compound recently expanded for the final waves of Japanese captives. Inside the first truck, the air was thick with sweat, canvas dust, and unspoken fear. The Japanese prisoners sat shoulder to shoulder on worn wooden benches, hands folded rigidly in their laps, uniforms wrinkled and frayed from months of attrition. They were a mixture of sailors rescued from sinking ships, infantry captured in the last island battles, and aviators who had survived crash landings or bailouts only to be taken alive, a fate they had been taught to dread more than death. One of them, a 26-year-old petty officer named Toshio Nakamura, stared at the bouncing floorboards beneath his boots. His thoughts drifted to his mother's small home outside Kobe, to the orchard his grandfather once tended, to the promise he had made before leaving for war, that he would never surrender. Yet here he was, breathing American air, being carried toward an American camp, his sword surrendered, his pride shattered into pieces too small to count. He had not spoken a word since capture. His throat couldn't form one. Another prisoner, a gaunt radio operator named Saito, clutched a small cloth pouch under his shirt. What remained of his brother's letter, nearly destroyed by rain and salt water. He had memorized the words, the handwriting, the final encouragement. Fight with honor, return only in glory. Now he carried that letter like a confession of failure. Across from them sat the American guards. Most were young men who looked older than their years from fatigue. Some had fought in brutal battles, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, Saipan, and bore the weight of memories they rarely spoke of. Others had been stationed on Oahu for supply duties, never seeing combat, but living with the constant tension of expecting an attack that had never come again after Pearl Harbor. Sergeant Daniel Dan Whitaker, a tall, broad-shouldered farm boy from Kentucky, sat near the tailgate. He had seen Japanese soldiers up close before, dead on the beaches of the Philippines, but never this close, never alive, never quiet. He noticed how thin they were, how sunken their cheeks looked beneath their helmets. They didn't look like the wild-eyed enemies American propaganda posters depicted. They looked like broken men. As the trucks neared the camp gates, the Japanese prisoners stiffened instinctively. The camp was larger than they expected. Rows of barracks built from fresh lumber, wire fencing stacked in 2 layers, guard towers overlooking the perimeter. Nothing about it looked improvised or chaotic. It looked organized, efficient, controlled. This, in itself, terrified them. Efficient captors could choose efficient cruelty. They had been prepared for beatings, starvation, humiliation, everything they had been taught American soldiers would inflict on them. But the first thing they smelled was something baffling. Not disinfectant, not ration rice, not the metallic tang of boiled vegetables, but something warm, smoky, rich. Nakamura lifted his head slightly, nostrils twitching. He did not recognize the scent, nor did Saito, nor did any of the others. It was unlike anything they had ever encountered in their military kitchens, and for a moment, the whisper of hunger inside their stomachs overpowered their dread. As the trucks rolled to a halt, the prisoners were ordered down in calm but firm English. They lined up instinctively, forming straight rows even without instruction. Old discipline never died, it only weakened. Inside the processing center, American medics moved in with stethoscopes, notebooks, and white armbands. The Japanese prisoners braced themselves, but instead of strikes or shouts, they were met with gentle prodding, quiet apologies for cold instruments, and soft commands to breathe in, hold still, sit down. Some of the POWs flinched when a medic touched their shoulder. Others trembled when a bandage was removed. A few expected a blow every time someone reached toward them. Instead, antibiotics were administered, wounds cleaned, temperatures taken. One medic frowned as he examined a long scar running down Nakamura's back. "How long you had this?" he asked, not expecting an answer. When none came, he shook his head and murmured, "Damn shame." The translator assigned to the hall noticed how many prisoners hesitated to even accept a cup of water. He whispered to Sergeant Whitaker, "They expect mistreatment. They don't know what's happening." Whitaker nodded slowly. "Hell, some of our boys expect to mistreat them," he said, under his breath. But orders are orders." When processing ended, the prisoners were given the universal hand gesture from the guards. Move forward. Move toward the next building. Move toward the source of the mysterious scent. They stepped into the doorway of the mess hall and froze. The air inside hit them like a physical force. A massive steel griddle hissed in the corner. American cooks flipped thick patties of meat with metal spatulas, the sound crisp and rhythmic. Hamburger buns sat stacked in neat rows, their tops golden. Another counter held crates filled with tall, curved glass bottles submerged in crushed ice. The bottles clinked as the ice shifted. Coca-Cola. A drink so foreign, so unknown to nearly every Japanese soldier present that they stared at it as if it were a myth. They had grown up with barley tea, green tea, water rationed in canteens, not sweet, bubbling cold liquid trapped inside shimmering glass. The cooks placed steaming hamburgers onto metal trays. The scent rolled across the room. Smoke, fat, salt, bread, something sweet. For men who had lived on thin rice porridge and worm-ridden biscuits for months, it was intoxicating. The prisoners stood rooted, unable to move. One cook, a young Navy man with grease on his apron, lifted a fresh burger toward them. "It's food," he said slowly, gesturing. "Eat." But the prisoners did not reach out. They looked instead at the guards, waiting for the inevitable blow, the unexpected cruelty, the punishment for wanting food. Sergeant Whitaker waved them forward gently. "Go on," he said. "It's okay. It's for you." A thin soldier with hollow cheeks stepped forward first. His hands trembled violently as he accepted the warm burger. He lifted it with the care one might use to hold a baby bird. His throat worked up and down. He bit slowly. The moment the taste hit his tongue, his entire face crumpled. His knees nearly buckled. He pressed a hand to his mouth as tears shot into his eyes. His shoulders shook as he struggled to chew. He had not tasted real meat in over 2 years. He had not tasted warm bread since basic training. The combination overwhelmed him. Another soldier was handed a Coca-Cola. He examined the bottle, confused. The cook popped the cap with a bottle opener. The fizz hissed wildly. The Japanese soldier yelped softly and jerked backward. The Americans chuckled gently, not mocking, just amused. The soldier brought the bottle to his lips and sipped. A shock ran through his entire body. The sweetness, the cold, the carbonation. It was like drinking fireworks. He let out a breathless gasp, then a choked sob. He clutched the bottle to his chest as if it might disappear. Within minutes, dozens of Japanese POWs were crying silently as they ate. Some wept openly, some turned away, ashamed of their emotional collapse. Others simply stood there, food held halfway to their mouths, their faces slack with disbelief. This wasn't just food. It was mercy. It was survival. It was a reminder that their bodies still mattered to someone. One older prisoner whispered, "Why? Why would enemies feed us like this?" Another answered with a shaking voice, Maybe they are not the demons we were told." The cooks kept serving. The guards kept watching. Not a single voice was raised in anger. After they had eaten every crumb, the prisoners bowed, once, twice, 3 times. Some bowed so deeply their foreheads almost touched the floor. The cooks were stunned. "Oh, heck," one muttered. "You ain't got to do all that." But they did. It was all they knew. Outside, when the prisoners were escorted to the barracks, many still held their empty Coke bottles like priceless treasures. One man polished his bottle with his sleeve again and again, marveling at the shape of it. That afternoon, while the Pacific wind brushed through the camp, the same prisoners sat in the yard, whispering to one another about what they had just tasted. Some tried to explain hamburgers to others, miming the shape, describing the warmth. Others tried to explain Coca-Cola, pointing at their throats, mimicking the fizz, laughing softly from the absurdity of it. And when the dinner bell rang, their hearts almost stopped. Another meal? Surely not. Surely the Americans could not be this generous twice. But they were. And when the second hamburger of the day touched their tongues, many prisoners broke down again. This time, not from shock, but from something deeper. Something like grief, finally thawing. For the first time since they had been captured, the Japanese POWs felt like they were being allowed to exist, allowed to breathe, allowed to live. And that was enough to make even the strongest men cry. The night settled softly over the camp, bringing with it a warm Pacific wind that rustled the palm fronds and carried the faint scent of grilled meat lingering in the mess hall. The Japanese prisoners lay on their cots, staring at the wooden rafters above them. Some clutched their blankets, whispering quiet prayers of gratitude or confusion. Others held onto their empty Coca-Cola bottles as if they were sacred relics. Many simply lay awake, unable to comprehend the day they had just lived. To them, American kindness felt more dangerous than cruelty. Cruelty they understood. Cruelty they had expected. But kindness threatened to unravel the entire belief system they had been raised on. Kindness left them defenseless. At dawn, the sound of distant waves blended with the heavy footsteps of guards on their morning rounds. The prisoners rose silently, folding their blankets with automatic precision before assembling outside in neat rows. They looked cleaner, clearer-eyed. The despair that had clouded their faces the day before had softened into something like fragile hope. The guards noticed it immediately. "Look at 'em," one private whispered. "They don't look half dead today." Sergeant Whitaker nodded slowly. "Food'll do that. Makes a man feel like a man again." The sun crept over the mountains, casting long shadows across the yard. The prisoners stood rigidly, unsure of what waited for them. Many expected the previous day's meals to have been a one-time gesture, perhaps a symbolic act of mercy to mark the war's end. Surely such abundance could not continue. Surely no enemy would feed captives like honoured guests. But the scent drifting from the mess hall once again twisted their stomachs. Eggs, bacon, toast, and something sweet. Something warm. Something astonishing. Breakfast. They entered the hall more cautiously this time, but the disbelief still showed on their faces. The cooks had prepared generous portions, scrambled eggs mixed with butter, golden toast brushed with syrup, and strips of bacon fried to crisp perfection. The smell hit them like a wave, a scent so rich and unfamiliar that many prisoners took involuntary steps backward. A cook lifted a tray of pancakes, steam rising in swirls. "Come on in," he said gently. "It's all for you." One prisoner, a 19-year-old conscript named Kenji, stared at the food with wide eyes. He had not tasted anything sweet in over 3 years. His mother used to make rice cakes on New Year's, and the memory struck him so suddenly that he felt his throat tighten. His hands shook as he accepted the plate offered to him. He took his first bite slowly. The sweetness hit him like a memory of childhood, a memory he thought the war had destroyed. Tears welled in his eyes, then overflowed. He pressed the heel of his palm against his mouth, trying to stifle the sob climbing up his throat. A guard watching nearby shifted uneasily, glancing away to give the young man the dignity of privacy. Another prisoner tasted bacon for the first time. The salty crunch made him freeze, blinking rapidly. He looked at the strip as if it were an alien object. Then he took another bite, and his shoulders shook. It was too much. The warmth, the flavour, the generosity. He bowed deeply to the cook serving him, unable to form the English words to express his gratitude. The cooks moved through the hall, refilling trays and offering seconds. They didn't understand the emotional weight these meals carried. To them, it was simply breakfast, a routine task. To the prisoners, it was an assault on everything they had been taught about the enemy. After breakfast, the prisoners were escorted into the yard for light labour. They swept walkways, cleaned communal areas, assisted with moving boxes or organising supplies. They worked silently and with surprising thoroughness. Some guards commented on it. "They work like they're trying to earn the next meal," one private said. Whitaker shook his head. "No, this is who they are. Discipline's in their bones." By mid-morning, the Hawaiian sun beat down on the camp, casting sharp shadows across the sandy ground. The prisoners moved more slowly now, not from exhaustion, but from a strange sense of calm. Their bellies were full. Their bodies no longer ached with hunger. Their hands no longer trembled from malnutrition. For the first time since being captured, they felt a sliver of peace. Around noon, the bell rang again. Lunch. The moment the bell echoed across the yard, every prisoner froze. Even the guards paused mid-step, watching the reaction ripple through the captives like a shockwave. "Holy hell," one corporal muttered. "They didn't think we'd feed 'em again." The prisoners lined up automatically, but their eyes betrayed a quiet fear that the kindness might end, that the previous meals were anomalies, that something terrible would follow the generosity. But when they stepped into the mess hall once more, the familiar scent washed over them. Hamburgers, warm, freshly prepared hamburgers, and Coca-Cola, bottles glistening with condensation. It was as if the entire room glowed. A prisoner named Ishikawa approached the serving line. He was older than most, 42, with streaks of grey around his temples. The cook handed him a hamburger, but instead of accepting it with both hands as he had the day before, Ishikawa dropped to his knees. The cook stared, startled. I don't think he's hurt," one muttered. Ishikawa bowed so deeply that his forehead touched the floor. Tears dripped from his chin onto the wooden boards. His shoulders quivered. He was not collapsing from weakness. He was overcome. One of the guards, a young corporal named James Riley, stepped forward, alarmed. Sir, are you all right?" The man raised his trembling hands toward the burger, clutching it like a sacred offering. In broken English he said, "You feed me twice. Twice." His voice cracked violently. "In my country, prisoner, must suffer. Enemy, no food, no warmth." His chest heaved as the emotion tore free. Why you give?" No American had a rehearsed answer for that. Riley crouched down, lowering his voice. "Because you're in our care now. We feed our prisoners. We feed everyone." The words stunned Ishikawa so deeply that he could not move. When Riley helped him stand, the Japanese soldier clung to the hamburger as though afraid it would vanish. Nearby, another prisoner lifted his Coca-Cola bottle and stared at the swirling bubbles with childlike amazement. He shook his head slowly, whispering, "Magic. It is like magic." When he took his first sip, he gasped, dropping the bottle, then snatching it mid-fall with a sharp gasp of relief. The guards laughed softly, but not unkindly. As the meal continued, the emotional reactions multiplied. Men sobbed quietly over their plates, overwhelmed by flavours they had never experienced or had nearly forgotten. Others laughed, a rare, fragile sound that startled even their fellow prisoners. Some bowed repeatedly to the cooks. Others simply stared at their food as if unable to believe it was real. The Americans serving them felt something too, a shift in perspective. It was impossible to watch such raw gratitude and not feel moved. Many of these same soldiers had lost friends to the Japanese. Some had sworn they would never pity the enemy. But here, seeing their former foes trembling over hamburgers, crying into bottles of Coke, those vows crumbled like wet sand. After lunch, the prisoners returned to their labour with renewed energy. They swept more vigorously, scrubbed more thoroughly, carried crates with a steadier pace, not out of obligation, not out of fear, but out of an instinctive desire to repay, even in the smallest way, the unexpected kindness they had received. During a break, two prisoners sat together under the shade of a large palm tree. One asked cautiously, "Do you think they will treat us like this every day?" The other hesitated, then whispered, "Maybe they do not see us as animals." Another prisoner, listening nearby, murmured quietly, "Maybe they see us as people." The thought was revolutionary. By late afternoon, the camp moved into quiet routine. The Americans prepared paperwork for eventual repatriation. The Japanese men wrote letters with trembling hands, telling their families they were alive, that they were being treated humanely, that they had eaten food more wondrous than any they had tasted in years. One letter read, "Mother, the Americans, they feed us. They treated my wounds. I do not understand it, but I think I will survive." As dusk painted the sky orange and purple, the bell rang for dinner. The prisoners lined up quickly, this time with hearts pounding in anticipation rather than fear. Dinner was simpler: meatloaf, mashed potatoes, vegetables, and once again, Coca-Cola. But to them, it was a feast fit for royalty. One prisoner bit into the meatloaf and whispered, "This tastes like kindness." Another drank his Coke and murmured, "Cold water from the mountains could not taste this good." When the last plates were cleared, many prisoners bowed again, not out of ritual, out of gratitude, out of a feeling they had forgotten how to express. As the guards escorted them back to their barracks, Whitaker walked alongside the column. He watched their faces, their postures, the way their eyes seemed brighter, less haunted. One Japanese officer approached him quietly. "You treat us good," he said, struggling with the words. "Too good." Whitaker shook his head. "No such thing." The officer swallowed hard. "In Japan, prisoner has no honor, no dignity." He paused. "But here, you give us dignity again." Whitaker looked away, deeply moved. "Everyone deserves dignity," he replied, "even in war." Inside the barracks, as the lights dimmed, the prisoners settled into their cots. The wind moved gently through the cracks in the wooden walls. A few men whispered prayers, others clutched their empty Coke bottles. Some simply lay there, staring into the darkness, with tears slipping silently down their cheeks. Not tears of sorrow, tears of being seen, tears of surviving, tears of tasting life again. And as sleep slowly overtook them, one thought lingered in their minds. If the enemy could be this merciful, then maybe the world could change. Maybe life could begin again. The morning of May the 10th arrived warm and windless, the ocean stretching out like a sheet of brushed glass. The camp stirred slowly, its usual rhythm softened by the strange peace that had descended over the Japanese prisoners since their arrival. In the barracks, men woke quietly, blinking into the pale glow filtering through the windows. Their bodies no longer trembled from starvation. Their hands no longer shook uncontrollably. Their faces, once hollow and gaunt, now carried a faint but unmistakable colour. For many of them, it was the first time in years that they had woken without fear. A few prisoners sat up on their cots, stretching stiff shoulders and rubbing sleep from their eyes. Others gazed toward the mess hall, already imagining the scent of breakfast drifting through the camp. The memory of hamburgers, bacon, pancakes and Coca-Cola had carved itself deep into their minds, not simply as food, but as symbols of a humanity they had not expected to encounter. At roll call, Sergeant Whitaker moved down the rows, checking attendance with practiced efficiency. He observed the men more carefully today, searching for signs of trouble or tension. Instead, what he found was a quiet sense of renewal. The prisoners stood straighter. Their faces were calmer. Some even made brief eye contact with him, something they had avoided on the first day. Whitaker nodded to himself. "Not so broken anymore," he muttered under his breath. The Japanese prisoners remained motionless, waiting for instruction. The guards exchanged glances. It was astonishing how disciplined the POWs were, how cleanly they fell into formation, how respectfully they moved when ordered, how silently they obeyed without resentment. A young American private leaned toward Whitaker and whispered, "Hard to believe these guys were the ones giving our boys hell on the islands." Whitaker didn't respond immediately. He looked at the prisoners, thin, tired, dignified despite everything, and finally said, "War turns everyone into something they're not. This is who they are underneath." As the prisoners marched toward the yard for morning inspection, the familiar scent of cooking drifted from the mess hall. It was eggs again, scrambled and soft, mixed with butter and thick slices of toast warming on the griddle. The prisoners inhaled deeply, almost involuntarily. The smell alone brought some close to tears. Inside the hall, the cooks worked with brisk efficiency. They had grown accustomed to the emotional reactions of the POWs, but they were still humbled by them. Every time a prisoner cried into his food or bowed so deeply his spine strained, it reminded the Americans how brutal the war had been on both sides. When the doors opened, the prisoners stepped inside with reverence. They received their plates carefully, almost ceremonially. Some whispered their thanks in broken English. Others bowed. One man clasped his hands together before taking the food, as though offering a prayer. A cook named Miller, an older man with a grey-streaked moustache, watched these gestures with a tightness in his chest. He had lost a brother on Guadalcanal. For years, he had carried a burning hatred of the Japanese, but watching these men tremble with gratitude over scrambled eggs, how could he hate them now? One prisoner took a cautious bite of toast, savouring the buttery warmth. His eyes closed as he chewed. Another tasted the eggs and exhaled shakily, overwhelmed by the softness, the richness, the simple goodness. To men who had eaten mouldy rice and rotten vegetables for months, this food felt like a miracle. During breakfast, something unprecedented happened. A young Japanese soldier, barely 20, suddenly began laughing. It was a short, breathy laugh, almost embarrassed, but it was unmistakable. Everyone, Americans and prisoners, turned to look. The young man immediately covered his mouth, eyes wide, as if he had committed an offence. But the cook serving him smiled and nodded at him, encouraging the laughter rather than punishing it. The young soldier lowered his hand slowly, then laughed again, this time louder. The sound was contagious. A few prisoners began smiling, a few chuckled, a few shook their heads in disbelief, tears mixing with laughter. For the first time since the war began, joy echoed in the hall. When breakfast ended, the prisoners filed out quietly, carrying with them the glow of the morning. They walked with purpose to their assigned tasks. Some swept the barracks, some repaired wooden crates, others helped unload supply trucks. Their movements were steady and efficient, not rushed, not fearful, but contented, as though the work gave them a sense of grounding. Around mid-morning, a group of prisoners was assigned to assist near the supply depot. The sun was warm but gentle, and the air smelled faintly of salt and sugarcane. A prisoner named Harada, who had served as a Navy engineer, worked in silence beside Private Riley. Riley noticed how carefully Harada handled every object, how he wiped dust from crates before stacking them, how he adjusted the corners to ensure perfect alignment. Riley finally asked, "Why so careful?" Harada paused, then answered in halting English, "Work shows heart." He tapped his chest gently. "We show respect." Riley was momentarily stunned. Then he nodded. "Well, you're doing a hell of a job." Harada bowed slightly, eyes warm with gratitude. Elsewhere in the yard, prisoners sat under the shade of palm trees during their break. A small group spoke in hushed tones about the meals they had received. One older man, a former schoolteacher from Kyoto, said, "I did not know the enemy would show such mercy. At home, we were told Americans are beasts." A younger soldier beside him shook his head. "No beasts feed prisoners like kings." Another whispered, "Perhaps we were wrong." The older man sighed deeply. Perhaps everyone was. By noon, the bell rang for lunch. The prisoners lined up with much less hesitation than before. But when they entered the hall and saw what the cooks had prepared, many felt overwhelmed all over again. Hamburgers, freshly grilled, steaming. Perfect. and bottles of Coca-Cola packed in ice so cold it smoked when the air touched it. Some prisoners covered their mouths with both hands, others clutched at their chests, breaths trembling. The emotional weight of the meal, its consistency, its generosity, struck them harder today than it had before. Food meant survival. Food meant dignity. Food meant they were no longer living like ghosts. One prisoner, a middle-aged sailor named Fujimoto, took his hamburger, sat down, and stared at it for a long time. His hands trembled, but his eyes were distant, lost somewhere in memory. When he finally took a bite, tears spilled immediately down his cheeks. He wiped them away angrily, ashamed, but the tears kept coming. A guard approached him cautiously. "Sir, you okay?" Fujimoto nodded weakly, then whispered, "This taste reminds me of a world without war." The guard swallowed hard and nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We all miss that world." At the far end of the hall, the cooks watched the emotional collapse of the POWs with a mixture of sympathy and discomfort. Miller leaned on the counter, rubbing the back of his neck. "I swear, every damn time, makes me feel like I'm watching a man come back to life." Another cook replied, "Maybe we are." After the meal, the prisoners moved through the day with renewed vigor. Work assignments were completed efficiently, tools were cleaned and returned with military precision. The camp doctor remarked on the improvement in their physical appearance, their color, posture, and hydration. The human body could begin to heal astonishingly quickly once fed. By mid-afternoon, Whitaker walked along the perimeter, watching a group of prisoners repairing a broken fence rail. One man hammered with careful rhythm. Another held the board steady. They worked together in silence, unified by purpose rather than fear. Whitaker approached and said, "Looks good, real good." The prisoners bowed slightly. One said in halting English, "We want to help, to show thanks." Whitaker nodded, moved. "You're doing more than enough." Later, during free time in the yard, some prisoners gathered in small circles, sharing stories from their past, childhood memories, family tales, festivals, and simple joys they had forgotten. One man described the taste of his mother's miso soup. Another spoke of a daughter he hadn't seen in years, his voice breaking with longing. Their words drifted softly in the warm breeze, like distant echoes of a life stolen by war. In the corner of the yard, a prisoner sat alone, clutching his empty Coca-Cola bottle with trembling hands. Whitaker approached him. "You like that drink?" "Huh?" The prisoner nodded shyly. "Sweet," he said softly. "Like happiness." Whitaker smiled faintly. "Yeah, that's what it tastes like." As the sun dipped low in the sky, painting the clouds pink and gold, the prisoners were called for dinner. Many hurried to line up, almost eager. When they entered the hall, they gasped again. Not because the food was extravagant, but because it was consistent, abundant, compassionate. Tonight's meal was simpler. Meatloaf, potatoes, bread, vegetables, and again, Coca-Cola. But simplicity meant nothing to men who had eaten rot and insects to survive. As they ate, an extraordinary thing happened. A prisoner stood, bowed deeply, and spoke in careful English so the cooks could understand him. "You treat us as humans. We not forget." The hall fell silent. The cooks froze mid-motion. Whitaker looked up sharply. The prisoner bowed again. Tears shimmered in his eyes. "Americans, show mercy. This save our hearts." Another prisoner stood beside him, then another, and soon the hall was filled with bowed heads. One cook covered his face with his apron to hide his emotion. Another stared at the floor, his eyes burning. Whitaker swallowed hard, feeling his throat tighten. When the prisoners finished eating and left the hall, their steps were lighter, their posture straighter. Their faces, though tired, glowed with something indescribable. In the barracks that night, as lanterns flickered gently, a prisoner whispered, "We will return home alive, and we will tell them. We will tell them Americans fed us." Another replied, "We will tell them Americans were not demons." Another murmured, "We will tell them kindness saved us." And as they drifted into sleep, the same thought pulsed through their weary hearts. The war had taken everything. But in an American camp, a hamburger and a bottle of Coca-Cola had given them back their humanity. For the first time in years, they dared to imagine a future.